Hi, this is Black Sequencer from Erica Synths. It has the ambitious goal of being the sequencing brain of a eurorack setup, and with envelopes and LFOs, it just might take over a few other organs. It's got 4 tracks, each with 3 lanes, CV, gate, and a third multipurpose mod lane. In this video, we'll take a look at its workflow. I'll walk you through this patch. We'll hear all of it at the end. And of course discuss pros and cons. Before I start, a quick disclosure. Erica Synths sent this over for review, but as always, they have no say over the content of this video. This channel is funded by viewers who subscribe to my content and book updates on Patreon, the ad you just skipped, or YouTube Premium, and the occasional affiliate link in the description, which helps the channel regardless of the product you choose to buy. One more thing, I'm reviewing a beta of the firmware and a pre-production unit. Even at the first launch of this, some features won't fully be implemented and are promised to be added in a future firmware update, like the CV gate and mod inputs and MIDI in and out aside from clock. And the contrast of the shift functions here, you see that where it says glide under CV, isn't that great here. I'm told that in the production units that will be improved as well. Other than that, the production units should be the same. With that said, let's start with an overview. Black Sequencer has 4 tracks. You can see them on screen here. Each of the tracks has 3 dedicated outputs, one for CV, one for gate, and one for mod, a multi-purpose output that repeats itself 4 times for each of the 4 tracks. Like I mentioned, these inputs currently aren't active. Presumably they'll be used for programming the sequencer, maybe modulating parameters, then MIDI in and out, hopefully to send notes out on MIDI and receive MIDI in for programming this with an external keyboard. Black Sequencer has an internal clock, but you can clock it externally as well, like I mentioned, through MIDI or using the clock input. The CV and gate output pairs are pretty much what you'd expect. This is quantized for notes. The CV and gate is simple gates where you can change the gate length. The mod output is the interesting one. It's a multi-purpose output. We'll look at this a bit more in depth later on, but generally what the mod output can do is either sequence continuous CV outputs, send out notes in parallel to the main note track, then be a bunch of envelopes. Again, we'll look at all this. Be a bunch of LFO options, and then also send out triggers in parallel and separately from the gate track. The way you use Black Sequencer is you first choose a mode, choose what you want to edit, and then you use these encoders to change the parameter on the page that you select. So for example, if I wanted to edit the notes on this track, I would just turn these around, and as you can see, when you actually touch an encoder, it shows its value in a nice big font. When you leave it, you'll see the value for all 16 steps, for all 16 encoders. The encoders can also be pressed or double pressed. So for example, here I can activate additional steps in this pattern. In the gate page, pressing a encoder will mute the step, and then double pressing will disable it entirely. So that's how you edit specific tracks. You can choose any track or channel you want using these 4 buttons. There are 16 encoders, so you only control 16 parameters at a time, but each pattern has up to 4 bars, which you change using the bar buttons. Patterns can be anywhere between 1 to 64 steps. When you choose a mode, these LEDs will show you what you can control. So for example, here, you can control the pattern length with this encoder, and you can shift the range around with this one, and choose the start position here. And the data encoder also usually does something. In this case, it's playback direction or playback type. Most of the times shift will get you to a secondary function, but occasionally setup will do that as well. So setup, aside from taking you into the overall settings, will say, for example, take you into additional parameters for the magic function, which we'll get to. So hit setup and magic, and you edit the magic parameters. The screen is OLED. It's relatively sharp, though pretty small, as you can see here. However, most of the times when you edit a parameter, like I said earlier, you'll zoom into what the value of that parameter is. So overall, that's what a pattern looks like, right? For channels or tracks. You have 16 patterns in a bank, and then each project can have 16 banks. You can also chain patterns, whether in temporary links or in songs. More about that in the performance section of this video. And one last thing about patterns, if you see this recording LED blink, it means I changed the pattern. If I swap patterns now, those changes will be gone. If I go to, say, another pattern now and make a change, you'll see it blink again. If I wanted to save that change, I would hit Shift Record. So that's it for the overview. Let's dive in and look at some of the details. Each track or each channel can run at its own rate. So if I hit the scale button, which isn't quantization, we'll talk about quantization in just a bit. Anyway, the scale can be either 1x, which is the default rate, and then either go up to twice as fast, or to 3/4, half, and up to an 1/8 slower than the master. The master length, by the way, is quantization for pattern changes. So say if I hit play, this is this pattern, and I can move to this pattern, oops, right here. And that move will be quantized. I could also move directly if I wanted, just by hitting Shift. So that's pattern scaling or quantization. Aside from that, let me just open a brand new pattern. You also have note quantization by hitting Shift and scale or quant. There are a bunch of scales here, and you can also program user scales. Let's just say, choose the minor scale. Once we do that, go into CVs. Any note that I pick will only be in the minor scale. Now in the intro and outro tracks, I use the mod output, which we'll talk about what it can do in a bit for envelopes to control the VCA. So that's the CV track. Pretty straightforward. Shift CV turns on glides. What you'd expect. Then the gate track is where things start to get interesting. You can set the gate length and tie notes by holding multiple encoders or double tap to disable a step. And I realize using gates makes this very clicky. We'll get to envelopes in just a bit. Shift gate gets you into probabilities. So that's straightforward. That can be either a percentage or an alternating pattern. So every second pattern, 2 out of 3, and so on. What you'd expect from that as well. Let's move through these quickly. Ratchets, again, what you'd expect. And repeats are different. They'll repeat a note. There's no one long note option here, like in Metropolis. Only repeats. Hopefully they'll add that as well. Then there's shuffle, and that's a global parameter, which you change with the data encoder. And you do have micro timing options as well. Get a nice zoom in when you edit a parameter. And I'll skip mod just for a bit, and let's talk about the arpeggiator. So you access that using Shift Arp, and this is an interesting per step arpeggiator. You don't hear it unless you activate ratchets. So let's say turn on ratchets for this step. As you can hear, what the arpeggiator does, it's either nothing, which is just repeat ratchets, then a few scale options, which would have been nice, I guess, if there would be an arpeggiator for the entire pattern. This is good potentially for chiptune style effects, especially if we ratchet up the ratchets. So it's a nice option. Now I'll get to mod in a bit. That's the third lane. Before that, let's talk about one more programming option, and that's magic. So what magic does is randomize values either in the entire track or for particular lanes in the track based on a range that you define for it. So say, for example, we've got this magnificent pattern. I could hold magic and press CV, and it would randomize the notes in that pattern. I could randomize the gate, which would do that, randomize ratchets, or just, randomize the whole thing. So that can obviously get quite chaotic. Let's start another pattern and do this in a more controlled way. So I've got a simple pattern here, 4 notes. Let's say that I wanted to randomize CVs, like I said, in a more sane fashion. Hold setup and magic, and now we can start editing the ranges for, let's say, note randomization. And this randomization does adhere to the scale. So let's choose say a minor scale. And now hopefully we'll get more normal results if we randomize CV. Okay, now we're starting to be within the bounds of control. If we don't like this pattern, we can do that again. And hopefully you get the idea. We could, of course, continue to randomize any other parameter, again, within the ranges or bounds of these options. Okay, so those are more or less the programming options here. Let's talk about the mod lane, and I'll connect that to my VCA again. So the mod lane, like I mentioned earlier, can do a number of things. You can edit what it does by holding setup and pressing mod. The CV option is simple. It just lets you set various values on a range for each step in your pattern, creating basically a custom LFO. Holding shift and turning the knob, by the way, gives you fine-tuned controls. Anyway, back to the mod types. Next option is notes. So quantized notes. Again, go into mod, and you can change these if it was connected to an oscillator. Next option is decay envelope. So when you do that, you've got selectable decay envelopes on a per step basis, which is really cool and useful. Then the next option is ASR envelopes. So that takes into consideration the gate length. And the next option is ADSR envelope. That gives a single ADSR envelope to the entire channel. And you configure that using these 4 encoders. So that applies to all the steps in the pattern. Next options up are an LFO, so you can hear that in action right now. This gives you control over the frequency, level, sync to the tempo. And some of these things don't work, including the LFO shape. In this firmware, it did in an earlier firmware, by the way, and I'm told there will be a number of shapes here, including sample and hold and morphing. So let's hope that happens. Then the next option, oops, here we go, is a per step LFO. So this is different. Again, no shapes here, but this would let you set a different shape in the final firmware on a per step basis. Let's keep going. Last option is trigger. This is pretty neat. This lets you program different triggers for the different steps, which are separate from the gate triggers on the gate track. I'll talk about all this in the patch notes section later, but overall I've got gate connected to the kick here, and then this trigger lane connected to the snare. So that's sequencing overall. Let's talk about a few performance functions. Like I mentioned earlier, you can change the direction of the pattern, and there are a few options here. Back and forth, ping pong with repeats. I guess these are snake options. And there's random as well. And if you hit shift, you get an overview of what's going on across all 4 tracks, which is neat. And you can change parameters for each of the 4 tracks using the rows of the encoders. So handy overall performance control mode, including scale or relative speed. Then if I go back to my old patterns, let's take a listen to a few more performance functions. You've got mutes, so you can choose to mute tracks if you wanted, or to solo a shift. And then you use pattern mode to swap patterns. So easily move from one pattern to the next. Nice animation there too. And you can easily create pattern chains by holding the pattern button and then just pressing the patterns in the order you want. Notice that little dots are added here. And you can also have a pattern appear twice if you wanted. It goes through the patterns. This one will play twice. There we go. So those are simple and temporary pattern chains. You also have a song mode, which you enter holding shift in song. And then you can add patterns to your heart's content here, including doubling patterns if you like. So very similar to pattern chains, temporary pattern chains, only you can edit these pretty easily, edit the repeats, and insert new ones in between if you wanted, which I think you, do like that. So create longer chains, and you can save these as well. So I think we covered almost everything. I didn't talk about banks, but you've got 16 banks of 16 patterns in a project, and there are a few handy clear copy and paste functions, so you can copy patterns and duplicate them, copy tracks and duplicate them. Before we head out to the pros and cons, I promised you a few patch notes and tips about the intro and outro music to this video. First, overall about the layout, I put black sequencer on the left to leave clear room for my handy timeline, but you'll probably want it at the bottom right of your case just because its patch points are on the top left, though this does accommodate for a more traditional left to right signal flow. Overall, I've got 5 tracks of audio here, 2 lead arpeggios, this is number 1, and number 2 coming out of Troika, as well as the main bass coming out of Troika as well, and then a drone coming out of the Ensemble Oscillator, and the drums, the kick and the snare coming out of Bitbox Micro here. Some of the sounds have onboard processing, so this pattern is going through Desmodus Versio, and the bass is going through FUMANA for that kind of grit. Then this pattern is filtered here through IO47 from Instruo with generous resonance. The audio is then routed over 5 tracks, 5 inputs into ES9, into Ableton Live, where there's a bit of EQ on some of the tracks and then a bit of reverb overall, and I control track levels using VCMC just as a generic MIDI controller. So I've got level control over each of the different tracks over here. Then finally for the setup, I've got Divkid's Oct giving overall texture flow to FUMANA, the Ensemble Oscillator, and the filter. It's sort of slowly modulating everything around a little bit. And then on the black sequencer side, it's easiest to see what the tracks are doing. I guess here you can see the first 2 tracks, the arpeggiator tracks, running at different rates. Then track number 3 is the bass. And track number 4 are the 2 drums. One of the drums is sequenced on the gate track and then another on the mod trigger track. And yeah, that's pretty much it. Envelopes here for track 1, going through Voicas VCA, and then for track 2, it's just simple gates sent to the VCA as well. One last little tip, always have a pattern that just plays the root note of whatever's going on in your song. So you can tune your oscillators easily. Okay, let's talk about the pros and cons. I'll address the hardware, which can't be changed separately, and the software or firmware, which likely will. On the hardware side, the build overall is excellent. The encoders respond as you'd expect. The layout is smart. I think the main disadvantage that I can think of is that the screen is relatively small when you're looking at a bunch of parameters altogether, as opposed to just changing one. Now, obviously, this enables a lot of functionality. The only alternative that I can think of would be a much bigger screen, which obviously would have made this more expensive, kind of like in the vector sequencer, which does cost substantially more than this. So I think this is an interesting compromise, but it is one that you need to be aware of. Another disadvantage of the overall workflow is that you use knobs to program notes as opposed to a keyboard. Hopefully the MIDI input will be enabled for sequencing so that you can use an external keyboard if you want. On the firmware side, this is pretty feature-rich as is. That said, if I had to mention a few features that I'd like to see in addition to what's already in here, I'd say my top 3 feature requests would be different length steps without activating the repeat function, the ability to transpose patterns, and chord support, not so much for MIDI, but rather for the arpeggiator, and along with that to have an arpeggiator that works not just over one step, but also across multiple steps. All 3 don't seem impossible within the scope of this interface, and from my experience of how the beta has evolved just in the past month, if more people than just me think those features are valuable, I wouldn't be surprised if Erica Synths just added them. Obviously, feel free to leave your wishlist features in the comments section below. So those were the cons. On the pros side, if you're looking for a brain for your eurorack setup, and like I mentioned, a few other organs as well, Black Sequencer is definitely worth a look. It's not that it has all the features other sequencers have. I've reviewed quite a few other sequencers on this channel, and you'll find features in others that this doesn't have. But there is a sort of like Goldilocks balance that was struck here in terms of the user interface, meaning that Black Sequencer isn't too difficult to learn and use, and yet it still allows for a lot of power, both as it is now and with what may be potentially added in future firmware updates. The flexibility in the mod lanes here is also very promising. It's great to be able to use them as either an envelope generator or even an LFO, just a free running one if you don't have one in your case or just need a spare or one that's tempo synced. So that's it for Black Sequencer. There's a whole eurorack for beginners chapter, as well as dozens of patch tips and ideas in my ever-expanding book, available to the good people who support this channel on Patreon. Hit like if this was useful, ring the YouTube bell to make sure you don't miss the next one. Thanks for watching.